Welcome to another deep dive into the reign of Emperor Qianlong. Probably know him for all the incredible territorial expansion, during his rule. But we're going beyond that today, using some lecture excerpts to explore what made his grand unification so unique. We're talking about the level of impact that really sets him apart from other Chinese emperors.
It's interesting because when we hear unification, we tend to picture, you know, military victories and redrawing borders.
Yeah.
But Qianlong's achievement was much deeper than that.
Okay.
He managed to solve a problem that had consistently tripped up even the most powerful dynasties before him.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What was this persistent problem that all these other rulers couldn't seem to crack?
It was the challenge of creating true stability. It wasn't just about conquering land.
Yeah.
It was about forging a system
Yeah.
that could hold it all together.
Okay.
For the long haul, think of it like a three-legged stool. Territorial expansion, effective centralized government, and a unified social identity. Many emperors could manage one, maybe two of those legs. But Qianlong was able to get all three working together, creating a stability that was pretty much unheard of in Chinese history.
So it's like he figured out the secret formula. But let's start with the part that we probably have the clearest picture of, the territorial expansion. We know Qianlong's China was vast, but what made it so different from the empires built by his predecessors?
It comes down to where that expansion took place. For centuries, the Great Wall served as this dividing line between the Central Plains and the nomadic regions to the north and west.
Okay.
Even powerful dynasties like the Han and Tang would hit a wall, literally. When it came to establishing lasting control beyond that point, they could win battles, sure,
Yeah.
but turning those wins into sustainable rule was a different story.
So even conquering those regions wasn't the real issue. It was keeping them under control, right? But we know Qianlong went way beyond the Great Wall, incorporating areas like Mongolia, Tibet, and even parts of Central Asia. He essentially redrew the map of China. So what did he do differently?
It wasn't just about having a stronger military. It required an unprecedented level of logistical skill. Think about the infrastructure needed to support military movement communication and the flow of resources across such a massive territory. The Qing dynasty had to build a system that could function across these incredibly diverse regions, which takes us the second leg of that stool, centralized government.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't rule a territory that vast without a way to effectively administer it. But military strength and efficient administration are pretty common features of empires throughout history. Was there something that made the Qing approach unique?
What stands out is that they couldn't just rely on brute force or a one-size-fits-all system. They had to develop strategies for governing a population that was incredibly diverse, not just geographically, but culturally and ethnically as well.
Right, and we can't talk about the unique challenges of unifying China without acknowledging this concept of Hua and Yi, right? It seems like Qianlong was dealing with cultural and political tensions that had been brewing for centuries.
Exactly. This historical debate gets at the heart of how the Chinese saw themselves and who they considered legitimate rulers.
Yeah.
The Hua traditionally referred to the Han Chinese, who were the dominant ethnic group, concentrated in the Central Plains. The Yi encompassed pretty much everyone else, often nomadic or minority groups, viewed as outsiders.
And according to traditional Confucian thought, only the Han had the right to rule China. But here comes Qianlong from the Manchu people, leading a dynasty that had to secure the support of a Han majority, while also gaining the submission of groups like the Mongols, Tibetans, and Uyghurs. It's mind-boggling how he managed to navigate that.
It was a balancing act, to say the least. He couldn't just replicate the approach of past dynasties, relying mainly on the support of the Han. He had to create a system where all these different groups felt like they had a place, a stake in this unified empire.
That seems like a recipe for disaster. Didn't another dynasty try this multi-ethnic approach and fail spectacularly? I'm thinking of the Yuan dynasty.
You're absolutely right to bring them up. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan did control a vast multi-ethnic empire, but they offer a stark contrast to Qianlong's success.
Okay.
Their rule was marked by instability, and ultimately they weren't able to hold it together for very long. Parts of their empire, like the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, broke away fairly quickly, and their rule in the Central Plains was riddled with ethnic tensions and rebellions. All told, they only lasted about a century.
Wow, that's a pretty short run compared to the Qing dynasty, which lasted nearly 3 centuries. But why were the Yuan so much less successful? Was it just bad luck, or did they make some fundamental errors that Qianlong was able to avoid?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's where things get really fascinating. We know the Yuan were masters of military conquest, but it seems like they really dropped the ball when it came to the long-term challenge of governing such a diverse population. That's where Qianlong's real genius comes into play. The Yuan, despite their vast empire, seemed to rely primarily on a system of dominance and extraction. They focused on conquering and controlling rather than integrating and unifying.
Okay.
That's a key difference from the Qing approach under Qianlong.
So it wasn't enough to just subdue the various groups within their empire. They needed to find a way to actually bring them together, create a sense of shared purpose, maybe even shared identity.
Exactly.
It's almost like they needed to win, hearts and minds rather than just battles.
And that's where the third leg of the stool comes into play, a unified social identity.
Okay.
Qianlong understood that he couldn't simply impose Han Chinese culture and values on everyone within his empire. That would only lead to resentment and eventually rebellion.
He couldn't just ignore those deep-seated cultural differences or try to erase them, right?
Right.
But how do you balance that with the need for a unified functioning empire? How do you create that sense of shared identity without erasing all those differences?
It's a complex issue, and I think the lecture excerpts really hit on this point. The Qing approach involved a delicate dance between centralized control and recognizing local autonomy.
Oh.
They implemented a robust administrative system with appointed officials throughout the empire. This ensured that the central government's policies could be implemented and enforced. But they also recognized the need to adapt those policies to fit the specific needs and customs of different regions.
So it wasn't just about having a strong military presence on the fringes of the empire. It was about establishing a government that could actually function and be respected across such a vast and diverse territory. Did they have to invent entirely new forms of governance to pull this off?
They did have to be innovative, and they were willing to experiment. One thing the Qing dynasty did that really stands out is that they didn't just extract resources from the outer regions to enrich the Central Plains. They actually had to invest heavily in those regions to ensure their stability and prosperity.
That's fascinating. It almost seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think that maintaining such a vast empire would require squeezing as much wealth as possible from the conquered territories. But the Qing were actually sending resources outward, like a constant investment in stability. Was this a common practice in empires throughout history?
Not really. If you look at colonial empires, for example, the focus was usually on extracting wealth and resources from the colonies to benefit the mother country. The Qing dynasty seems to have taken a much more long-term view, recognizing that the strength of the whole empire depended on the well-being of all its parts.
Because they were playing the long game. And it seems like it paid off, considering the Qing dynasty lasted much longer than many other empires throughout history.
That's a great point. The Qing understood that true unification isn't just about military victories or drawing lines on a map. It's about recognizing that different people can coexist and even thrive together under a system that is fair and respects their differences. And this is where the contrast with the Yuan becomes even more stark.
I can see that the Yuan were notorious for their brutal conquests and harsh rule. They really leaned into that idea of dominance, which probably explains why they faced so much resistance and ultimately couldn't maintain their empire.
Precisely. And the lectures actually bring up some interesting historical parallels.
Okay.
They mention how internal divisions and resentment from marginalized groups contributed to the collapse of other massive empires, like the Romans and the Ottomans.
That's a really sobering thought. It seems like the most powerful empires can be surprisingly fragile. It's not enough to conquer. You have to find a way to keep it all together. But getting back to the Qing, were there any downsides to their approach? It seems like constantly funneling resources to the outer regions must have been a huge drain on the central government.
It certainly wasn't cheap. And it did create a lot of logistical challenges. And while their system was innovative for its time, it wasn't perfect. They still faced their share of uprisings and rebellions. But what's remarkable is that they were willing to learn from those challenges and adapt their approach as needed.
So they weren't afraid to adjust their strategies and policies. When things weren't working, they didn't just stick to the same old playbook even when it was causing problems. That must have taken a certain level of humility and pragmatism, especially for emperors who were used to having absolute power.
I think that adaptability was crucial to their longevity. The lectures emphasize how they constantly had to refine their policies, balance the needs of different groups, and ensure that the benefits of being part of the empire outweighed any perceived disadvantages.
It's making me think back to our three-legged stool analogy. Strong centralized government, significant territorial expansion, and a unified social identity. It really does seem like Qianlong found a way to get all three working in sync.
He did, which is incredibly impressive. And I think the key takeaway here is that the kind of lasting unification that Qianlong achieved required a very different approach from the empires that came before him. It wasn't just about power and control. It was about creating a system that worked for everyone, a system that fostered a sense of shared purpose and belonging.
So he wasn't just focused on conquering and controlling. He was building for the future. But the lectures didn't really get into the specifics of how he achieved that, did they?
Right. They focus more on the overall context and challenges he faced. They leave us with more of a "so what" question, which I think is even more intriguing. Knowing what we know about Qianlong's remarkable achievement and the strategies he employed, what can we learn from his approach? What lessons can we apply to the challenges we face today, whether on a personal level or as a society?
Ooh, now that's a thought-provoking question. It's like they're challenging us to go beyond just absorbing historical facts and to actually think critically about how we can use those insights to navigate the complexities of our own world. It's a great point. We often think of history as something that happened in the past, something we can learn from, but not necessarily apply to our own lives. Right. But this deep dive has really highlighted how those lessons from the past can be surprisingly relevant to the challenges we face today.
I completely agree in that. What's striking about QianLong's story is that it challenges our assumptions about what it takes to create lasting unity. We often think about it in terms of power, dominance, forcing people to conform to a single ideology. But Qianlong's approach was much more nuanced and ultimately much more successful.
He seemed to understand that true unity isn't about erasing differences, but finding a way to make those differences work together. It's like a mosaic, where each individual piece contributes to a larger, more beautiful whole.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the fact that creating a unified society, whether it's a nation, a community, or even a team within an organization, requires a certain level of understanding and respect for the individual pieces that make up that whole.
It makes you wonder if maybe we've lost sight of that idea. In our modern world, we seem so focused on our differences, on what divides us, that we forget the importance of finding common ground, of working together towards a shared goal.
And that's where I think the lessons from Qianlong's reign can be so valuable. He showed that it's possible to build a strong and unified society that embraces diversity, a society where different groups can coexist and even thrive.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about, but I have to admit I'm still a bit baffled by how he pulled it off. The lectures didn't really delve into the specific strategies he used to achieve that delicate balance between central control and local autonomy. What were the nuts and bolts of his approach?
Unfortunately, these excerpts don't offer a detailed playbook, and I suppose that's part of the challenge. They're posing to us. If we are in Qianlong's shoes, facing this complex web of cultural, political, and logistical challenges, what specific strategies would we employ to achieve that kind of grand unification?
It's like they're encouraging us to step back from the role of passive observer and actually put ourselves in the shoes of a historical figure to grapple with the same dilemmas they faced. That's a much more engaging way to learn than just memorizing facts and dates.
Absolutely. It makes history come alive in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and personally relevant.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Emperor Qianlong's remarkable reign. It's been an incredible journey exploring not just the historical facts, but the deeper implications of his achievement.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope it sparked some curiosity. I encourage you to dig a bit deeper into this fascinating period of history and maybe even consider how the lessons from Qianlong's reign might apply to your own life and the challenges we face today.
Beautifully said. And that's what the deep dive is all about. Taking a deep dive into complex topics, uncovering hidden gems of knowledge and intrigue, leaving you with more questions than answers. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains buzzing.